Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations with Nicola Dunn and Robert Rowland Smith. Today, Nicola, we decided we'd have a go at the topic of solitude and loneliness. I'll say a few words maybe to kick us off and see if that prompts anything for you. I was reminded the other day, looking at my Shakespeare app on my phone, sort of shows you what a nerd I am, that the word lonely was invented by Shakespeare. Of course, one of many words that Shakespeare invented, but it's strange to think that people could have gone, 1600 years since the birth of Christ without using the word lonely, and thousands of years before that without using it. So loneliness and solitude perhaps aren't the same thing. So let me have a go at making a separation or a distinction between the two things, because I don't think solitude in and of itself carries any emotional baggage or charge to it. Solitude is just the state of being alone. Loneliness, I think, does carry an emotional charge. It's the solitude that comes with a sense of being in a solitary state and missing other people, or feeling somehow that that's not enough, or that one is somewhat bereft or in a state of unsupportedness or lacking resource in some way. So I do think there's a distinction to be made between solitude and loneliness. And if one thinks of desert islands and desert island discs and so on, there are people who fantasize about the solitude of being on the desert island, the opportunity to be away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, the nagging of people around, the incursions of what it means to be human, really, and having to deal with all those relationships, and the sense of relief, I suppose, that solitude brings. So there is, for many people, I think, a positive spin to solitude. But when we talk about loneliness, of course, we're talking about the more negative aspects of solitude, and it will vary obviously from case to case. And if I think about reading Robinson Crusoe, which I reread a few years ago, actually, which is perhaps the text on, certainly in the Western canon, on solitude and loneliness. It's interesting how he does experience loneliness, but solitude for him is also an opportunity to explore his own resourcefulness. And if nothing else, Robinson Crusoe is a study in the resourcefulness that's forced upon us when we are alone or in solitude without necessarily being lonely, because then you have to do everything for yourself. So it's quite interesting for human beings, having been born into a state of helplessness when we're very young and generally looked after, to then be in a state of kind of absolute self-reliance, which solitude seems to impose upon us. So anyway, there's just a thought, maybe we can start with that distinction between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is perhaps emotion-free as a state until we ascribe an emotion to it, whereas loneliness is obviously an emotion in itself, which is associated probably with a sense of sadness or lack in some way.
Wonderful, Robert. And I think if we were for a moment to leave let's say, prisoners aside, in a modern Western world, solitude is normally a choice. And there's something about it, the sense that the individual has a sense that perhaps they will gain something, as you said, whether it's the reliance on the self or it's the lack of distraction, that they will somehow come back into alignment with themselves and reflect, sometimes in a spiritual way or philosophical or just being with nature. But there is a sense that it is a movement back in a way that's chosen. And loneliness seems often to have, there's an element of something lacking, an emptiness, a lack of contact, whether that is physical touch, companionship, consideration of others. And so there's a yearning involved in loneliness that clearly is not present in a chosen kind of solitude. Of course, the two can move between the two. And, I'm someone who likes solitude, and I can feel lonely at times. I need contact. but it's about this movement
Mm,
and about the agency and the choice. And I think perhaps most of the people that maybe you and I come across might not say that they choose loneliness.
mm. I like that distinction. I don't think one would ever choose loneliness, even if one would choose solitude. And I was saying I once had a person come as an issue holder to a constellation whose opening words were, "I'm good on my own, but I'm sick of it."
Mm.
So this was a person who'd adapted to solitude, or perhaps didn't adapt, had it naturally in them, but for whom solitude was beginning to tire a little bit, to pull or to fray, and it was edging into loneliness, and perhaps they were going backwards and forwards between those two states, as you say. I was thinking about now, okay, how do we now apply this to the world of constellations and the systemic in general, which is our context for these conversations? And there's a lot of talk in constellations about two things which are connected but different and maybe in opposition to one another. One is bonding. It's a very striking Hellinger word, at least. Bonding is a word that comes up a lot in the texts, at least, of Bert Hellinger. So bonding, which is obviously bonding to another person, typically. And fate, which is a word that comes up a lot again in the kind of Hellinger canon. So we have bonding and we have fate in constellations. And I'm thinking of those because they're both related to the idea of solitude and loneliness. And typically, in a state of loneliness, people who arrive as issue holders in a state of loneliness wish to make a bond of some kind, whether it's recovering a bond that's been broken to a family member, for example, a parent or a sibling. And actually, in brackets, I'm now noticing how frequently broken sibling relationships arise in constellations. In my experience, maybe yours is different, but it does come up a lot, broken sibling relationships. On the one hand, so that's loneliness and bonding, or the failure to bond resulting in loneliness. And then in terms of fate, I think we've touched on this before. We certainly recorded a conversation about fate. But one of the operating distinctions I think some people make in constellations is that fate is the thing that we arrive with in the world, the conditions and circumstances that have shaped who we are, when we're born, what gender we are, what circumstances we're born into, and that's our fate. And that destiny is something that then we would move towards, like a destination. And one of the distinctions we can make there is that destiny, so to use the phrase, same fate, different destinies. So even in a family, you can have siblings who also have the same fate in the sense their context is the same, but their destinies are very different and they live very different lives. So destiny would be something that is a separating function. And in fact, there is something about certainly solitude, if not loneliness, which puts us in touch with something quite deep in ourselves, our relationship to ourselves and where we're going in life, and perhaps even our soul. So that soul and solitude, for me at least, if I'm joining the dots here, would be connected in quite an important way. It might be easier at least for the soul to become clear to oneself in a state of solitude and self-relation in a way that it might not be so easy for it to become clear when one is around other people all the time or in a relationship all the time, because that takes up bandwidth.
Yes. Wonderful, wonderful, Robert. And if I could add into that on a constellation note, the term of belonging,
Yeah.
that a lot of work is done on that in constellations. And also this idea of receiving the life flow from parents. And a lot of emphasis is put on that in constellation work, the idea that there is something mysterious, but incredibly important about taking life from one's parents. And at the same time, there can also be things that interfere with that. If a parent is more connected with, their own parent who died early, or some other aspect in a constellation, that flow may be quite thin through them as well.
Mm.
And I think if a individual has struggled with that deep connection into parents and taking life regardless of the vagaries of the parent's personality, and sometimes it is very difficult,
Mm.
it can make those connections with others quite challenging. So there can be this deep sense of loneliness because those fundamental flagstones that ideally would have been laid down as a foundation for human contact going forward in this life have somehow been a little bit misshapen or misaligned.
Mm. Let me build on that then, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about what happens during the teenage years for children of parents, and the tussle, I suppose, over belonging and not belonging. We've both parented teenagers, so we slightly have some form in this, perhaps. But one of the things this is a generalization, but perhaps it will help us a bit. One of the things that marks out teenagers is exactly they need to separate from the mum and dad, if it's that kind of a traditional setup, to separate from the mum and dad, to draw a boundary around their belonging and say, actually, your values suck. This is not where I identify. I'm with a different thing altogether. But that movement is often a movement from one belonging group, i.e. the one you've been brought up in, mum and dad, to another belonging group, usually peers. So I think everything you believe in, dear mum and dad, is nonsense. I'm with this lot now over here who tend to be the same age, and we all believe in X, which is probably the diametric opposite of the Y that you represent, And that's a necessary process. It's a process of separation, and that's sort of well known. But it is a movement it's not a movement into solitude or even loneliness necessarily, unless, as you say, there hasn't been, those flagstones or paving stones hadn't been laid down in the first instance, where there is a kind of loneliness through a failure of attachment, perhaps. But what I find interesting is that there's a sort of echo of that in later life, often in middle age, I think, or maybe in the 40s. Again, these are huge generalizations, perhaps they're stupid, but I think there are lots of people who go through some sort of period of reflection in their, let's say, 40s, midlife, where in fact they recognize it's not about moving from one belonging group to another, but actually there is an important call to a period or moment of reflection, self-reflection, which requires solitude and introspection and not being around others, not simply joining another belonging group, in order to sort of reassess where one's going or recalibrate or just adjust the compass a little bit. And that's a sort of spiritual solitude, which I think is worth bringing in here. I mentioned Robinson Crusoe, that's sort of spiritual, but I was also thinking of, monastic communities where solitude is embraced precisely for that purpose of prolonged introspection in order to correct the course of one's life in some way.
Yes, wonderful, and really wonderful. And I was thinking about those teenage years, and I think sometimes what's a little problematic is the young person, they have a fairly blunt knife in which to sever this relationship with the parents, and they're soaring away. And they, as you say, they want to be with this new vanguard, their peers, but they realize that sometimes it's a bit of a floppy flotation device. And so it's not always an easy transition. That's why we sometimes observe that they get something from their peers, but they also, their belonging to that group feels a lot more fragile and sometimes constrictive, and they can be ousted, and there's all sorts of things that are happening. And really, as you say, perhaps what might be better is some period, some transition. Often in some more traditional cultures, they have this, where young people are taken into nature and they need to discover something in themselves that is more secure and reliable. And they do that often through adversity and challenge in nature and having very little resources given to them. And I have some dear friends who do that for veterans in the US, and part of their coming back into society is being taken out into the wilderness and reliving what they need to relive and finding these new resources within themselves in order to integrate into society. So I think if I can just collect some of your other thoughts. So I think that's wonderful. And you kind of are hinging it also in midlife, where I think the same thing is asked of us. If it doesn't happen at 40, it will definitely happen at 50, where you're required to go in again and to maybe have some moments of solitude, but also tolerate some loneliness that it may create as you kind of reorientate yourself and decide, okay, is this the life I really want to live for the next half of my life? Am I going to be looking back into youth, or am I going to be looking forward into some form of emerging wisdom that could be possible?
Yeah, and at the back of my mind, I was thinking of both Dante and Nietzsche. They're obviously completely different ways. Talk about midlife as that point of solitude and reflection. Dante's Divine Comedy, the very first line is, halfway through life's journey, I found myself in a dark forest. And it can present as a crisis. That solitude can present as a crisis, but the crisis is actually it sounds glib now in saying it, but presents as a crisis, but is actually an opportunity in some way, because suddenly the coordinates fall away, you've slipped the moorings, and you're kind of all at sea, or in a forest in Dante's metaphor. And Nietzsche says in his own autobiography, he says something similar. He says it happens at the age of 44. He's very precise about it. Talks about the kind of noontide, before noon and after the afternoon. And a kind of similar process, but the solitude is absolutely necessary to it, because you've gathered enough experience to be able to sift through things, but you've got enough life left to be able to do something with it, really, and make some orientation or reorientation in your life. And in a way, perhaps that's kind of in a way what spirituality is in some sense. It's the ability to sort of take the best of solitude, which is that ability for introspection, and then be in the world at the same time, and balance, have these kind of two weights that you kind of carry forward as you participate in the world. And you're not just, like you were saying earlier with teenagers, just sort of blown this way and that according to the latest trends or fashions, perhaps.
So I think it's wonderful as you're describing this, because I'm seeing that, so loneliness has the yearning, it has a sense of, I haven't had or don't have now what I want, which is the capacity to have the kind of human contact connection that I want. And that will come up commonly in constellations. And, we have ways of just opening that up with our issue holder or seeker.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, solitude seems like almost like a spiritual requirement over the arc of a life. That at certain points it may be more sort of central, so it requires going away or being on a retreat or something where there's a lot of physicality to the solitude. You create a structure which allows it. But then perhaps as you move forward in the second half of life, you learn how to do it, in an urban setting without having to have that structure, because you understand that it connects you so much more deeply into your essential sense of self, and through that self into connection with others. And that somehow so solitude, I mean, if you're asking me to choose, solitude is, I think, highly desirable, whether it occurs in a moment because of what it brings. And loneliness is something that perhaps we need to move the needle to the exact point of human contact that serves us, and to explore that within ourselves.
I like the fact you mentioned the urban context. And one of the paradoxes is that, you know, you can be lonely in a crowd, to use that sort of well-known saying. And I think it extends beyond the physical realm into the digital realm. I mean, one of the strangest paradoxes of our modern life is that, you know, in the maelstrom of social media, loneliness seems to be actually increasing rather than decreasing. There was a report a few years ago, actually, about teenagers again feeling more and more lonely rather than more and more connected. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, which didn't help. But there is that contrast, I suppose, between the busyness, the connectivity, which we're all get here, you and I speaking over Zoom today. You know, we've got mobile phones on the desk. Probably I've got mine. I have an Instagram account. You know, I can connect with all sorts of people and experiences and message people and so on all of the time. So it's quite interesting that loneliness isn't necessarily mitigated by contact per se. Loneliness needs something more than contact. I remember when I was in psychoanalysis for a few years. Of course, you're never in psychoanalysis just for a few weeks. It was a few years, probably decades. It was. I've probably erased that. But I do remember this phrase my psychoanalyst would use, and she would use this phrase "good contact," which I always enjoyed and sort of took away as one of my lessons from that period. And she would say, you know, essentially, what good contact have you had today? I mean, you know, because there's good and bad contact. The contact itself is sort of neutral, a bit like solitude, I suppose. There's good and bad solitude. And contact per se, and especially if you're an introvert, and I tend that way, and I think perhaps you do a little bit, contact per se, it isn't a benefit. You know, it depends on the quality of contact.
Yes, and that leads us into that sort of experience, which does happen in constellations, of being touched, what it means to be touched. And, you know, I think we understand that with a baby, you know, that with the baby, you know, human physical skin on skin contact seems to be highly beneficial.
Hmm.
There's something about, you know, creating a sense of self which really thrives through that kind of contact.
Yeah.
And then, as you know, we all desire physical touch and contact to some degree. I think even the most introverted would like a fingerprint touch, you know, at least, and some of us want more. And so I think, and then we think of it more kind of psychologically and even spiritually, of actually being touched. And I'm interested to hear how you would describe it, because I think it's quite hard to define in a way.
Yeah, and let's refer our viewers and listeners to the conversation we had about touch, you know, a few goes ago. But yes, because we have the notion of touch is both physically touched and touched at a sort of spiritual level. And it suggests something intimate, doesn't it, being touched. But then I was thinking, as you were talking about the experience in a constellations group, where often, you know, say there's an average of about a dozen, 15, 20 people in a group. Often a number of those people are completely unknown. There might be one or two people you recognize, but often there are strangers or semi-strangers, at least in a group. And actually the last constellation session I ran, there was a issue holder who had expressed a difficulty with public speaking, and the kind of nervousness arose with that. And not for the first time, actually. I've had other issue holders presenting with the same issue. And it was towards the end of the evening. We didn't have a lot of time. So I decided to do a particular version of a constellation, which I call, and this is my own sort of idiosyncrasy, I think, a sort of ceremonial constellation, where instead of going through the whole family system, you're doing something shorter, but one hopes beneficial. So I had the issue holder and their representative, and then all of the people in the circle stand up and represent the audience for this person's public speaking. And it was very moving, because the will of that group was nothing except for the issue holder to succeed, and for them to, as it were, bless their ability to succeed and to be able to speak in public with more confidence. And I'm mentioning that because these were strangers who were able to create contact and touch and overcome solitude through a completely different mechanism that wasn't to do with intimacy. It was a kind of collective contact, a collective contact based not on knowledge of the other person, not on intimacy, not on any physical intimacy for sure, not even on, knowledge, but just on the kind of goodwill of the group. And it made me, I suppose, in connection to this conversation, appreciate that loneliness doesn't always have to be remedied through intimate contact or even the contact with a friend, but actually the kind of human, a collective will for one's life to go well, which is astonishingly kind of available there all the time. The kindness of strangers, I suppose, is the underlying moral of this particular story, and how readily available it is.
Yes. And I think actually the antidote to loneliness is kindness.
Yeah.
And probably if one is feeling lonely, the first step is to be as kind to as many people as you can on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Because it tends to be what you give out comes back, from a different direction, but there is a sort of circular process there.
Mm.
So I think, and I know how hard that can be for some people who struggle with loneliness very deeply, but reaching out, sort of giving something is often the best response, because
Yeah.
it puts you into that deep kind of humanitarian contact. You're kind to someone where there is no natural benefit to you in that moment from that person.
Yeah.
It's a gesture, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you see that when people give their seat up in the tube or whatever.
Yeah. It reminds me, I mentioned Instagram earlier, and I noticed a friend of mine had posted a quote today. Funny, I could remember who said it, but the quote was, "You can judge the character of a person by how they treat somebody from whom they have nothing that they can expect in return, like from people who can give them no benefit whatsoever." I thought that's very good.
Wonderful. And there's someone who defines that as friends are people who have, there's no sort of deal business kind of aspect to it. That's a real friend.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have a lot of time left, but maybe one point I've been itching to mention here is the connection, because I had also remembered another constellation I ran for somebody who had presented with loneliness. And in that constellation, it transpired that really the kernel of the loneliness was boredom. The problem with being alone was not necessarily the lack of context, but just how tedious it was. Here I am alone in my house. I've made the bed, I've done the cleaning, I've done the washing up, I've watched the program, I've, done my emails, now what? And what transpired in that constellation, which perhaps could be generalized a bit, I don't know, is that just as good contact and kindness might be a sort of remedy for loneliness, I think creativity might as well be, because in her case, what came out was, she'd been quite a creative person in her teenage years, early 20s, and that had fallen away. But when she remembered she'd been very good at drawing, and I think she was quite a crafty type person, it answered the need of loneliness, or at least the boredom aspects of loneliness, very well. Because it became an absorption and a sense of being held in a space where there were, what it's like, deep play. Deep play is a sense of real flow and absorption and contentment, I suppose, that doesn't require other people. It doesn't require you to pick up the phone and say, hey, let's go out and have a drink or something. I thought that was quite an interesting way out of it.
It's beautiful. And I would add its presence.
Yeah.
Its presence is an answer to loneliness.
Hmm.
Because presence takes you below the lack.
Exactly.
On that note, we can finish. So, Robert, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you to everyone who's been listening to us, watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. That's really helpful for us. And you can find Robert at robertrowlandsmith.com, and he's mentioned the different ways that he's available. And I'm at nicoladunnconstellations.com, and we hope that you'll be with us again. Thank you.